understand why they're getting angry in the context that it's happening, but then also to elicit their own reasons and motivations for why change might be helpful to their relationships, their careers, their physical health. And so it's very much about eliciting from the other person what they truly value, what they want their lives to look like. And we found that once angry clients sort of agree that their anger isn't working and they have this type of awareness, they're very willing to jump into treatment activities and take productive steps to change their patterns.
We already talked about the fact that there are all sorts of different angers, but Doug, your latest book is called Why We Snap, Understanding the Rage Circuit in Your Brain. So listening to Chip there, from your perspective, these anger management techniques, do you think they are in any way useful?
Yes, they're useful for lowering chronic stress, and chronic stress puts these triggers on a hair trigger, so that's where they're most useful. But a study last year showed that in the UK, every 20 minutes there's a road rage incident. So more important is understanding why you're angry. So let's take this for example. Someone cuts in front of you in your lane. Suddenly you're feeling overwhelmed with anger. You can try to suppress that anger, but that's difficult. And, count to 10, and these are all good things to do. But we know telling someone who's angry to calm down doesn't often work. Better to be able to quickly say, well, why am I angry? Why am I suddenly angry? Because this guy has cut in front of me. And if you can learn to recognize these 9 triggers, you would see that that's the E trigger, that this person has invaded your environment, your territory, and we're hardwired to respond aggressively to protect our territory. You would also realize that that's a misfire. Your brain never evolved in a situation, it knows about territory around your home, but it doesn't know about driving. This is an illusion that this is your space around you. If this person's on your front bumper or your back bumper, it makes a second difference in the purpose of the activity of transportation. And if you're running over ground and having a foot race, you don't get angry if somebody cuts in front of you. So this is a misfire. I think all the guests have said that we have this circuitry because we need it. We need anger. It's not pathology. What we're trying to avoid is misfiring of this circuitry in inappropriate situations.
Tiffany, I'm thinking back to Seneca and his advice. It's kind of not that different, is it?
It's almost identical, actually. It's because of the sense of the importance that Seneca puts on and that Doug's just put on, sort of trying to understand the triggers, taking a pause, say, what's caused this and is it rational to behave like this? And, I think there's no doubt that that's an extremely important skill to be able to cultivate, and goodness knows I wish I had a bit more of it. But I just also recognise that, not that you've said that all anger needs to be dismissed, but that it's also important to recognise those aspects of our life where anger is helpful, where it is, perhaps not operating in this kind of dangerous zone of say, road rage and aggression. But, as Chip was saying, that you can separate aggression and anger, and that there are other kinds of anger which actually we may want to also be aware of, so that we can be aware of anger as a sort of whole picture in our lives, and be less at risk, I think, of pathologising it and demonising it and sort of wanting to sort of extract it from our lives.
I was thinking back to the first on Chip's list for the alien, which is make sure that you hone in on every case of injustice. But surely you could argue there is a place for righteous indignation.
Absolutely. I mean, I was thinking, I had exactly the same thought when I heard that. And of course, I was thinking about Arundhati Roy, the Indian writer and activist whose writing is sort of deeply emotional but very defiant and haughty and righteous and dignified, and this is indignation at its best. Indignation is a very articulate kind of anger. I think also about that wonderful speech given by Julia Gillard in 2012, the Australian ex-Prime Minister, and this was, it was furious, but it was also incredibly contained and controlled, and I wouldn't want to live in a world where that kind of speech didn't happen.
So does that mean, Chip, that we need, when we think about anger and the sort of work you do on anger management, to make a difference between controlled anger, rational anger which is driven by a sense of injustice and therefore about ideas, and anger which is entirely about emotions and things which operate at a lower, more unseen level, the sort of thing that Doug was talking about?
No, I think emotion's part of being a human being. It's sort of woven into our lives and who we are. I guess I'd like to introduce a little bit of optimism into the picture here. That the treatment literature is pretty optimistic that There's been a couple of big meta-analytic reviews that have happened since the year 2000, and they all reach the same conclusion, that people that get anger treatment do significantly better than people that don't, and they improve at moderate to strong rates. And the interventions are not as simplistic as counting to 10. There's a whole range of, I think, empirically supported interventions that make sense for people that have anger problems. And there's not one way that people can take steps to improve their anger. There's many sort of good ways to do it. And a couple of them involve things like, instead of just reacting, kind of stepping back and learning to consider all your options. We call this sort of problem solving. It's the exact opposite of what angry clients do. They just kind of react very impulsively and quickly. If you can get someone to slow themselves down, consider their options, try to pick the best one, and think where it's going to take them, they tend to do better.
But what about the whole idea of venting your anger, so that anger can in some ways be cathartic? Have you ever thought of it as some kind of therapy that you could use in a clinical setting?
Well, we certainly would not do this in treatment because this idea has been around for a long time. And it's been studied in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. And there's very few studies now because I think we already know the answer to this. Venting as a treatment makes people worse, not better. And so this is a problematic intervention, and it's not something of the past. I mean, we're seeing a new phenomenon now called anger rooms, where people can go rent a room and destroy it and get their anger out. And so the problem with this intervention is...
Where does that come from?
I don't know. I've seen it on the internet, and there's advertisements for this, and it's been written up in a couple of business magazines where I guess executives can relieve their anger and stress by kind of, destroying rooms and breaking mirrors and tables and things like that. But there's been different iterations of this. I think if you go back to the 70s in your couples therapy, you might be given a foam bat, and you can kind of hit your partner when you're angry with him or her, not really hurt them. But the problem with this intervention is that we're teaching people to practice certain types of behaviors. And so if we view anger as an emotional experience, something that you feel inside your body, and then we tell the person, when you feel angry, go out now and do some motor behavior. So if you can imagine this kind of scenario, you got a guy who is in treatment and he has trouble with his romantic partners, and you think he's kind of he's sort of assaultive, and he's got a new girlfriend, and you're supposed to help him. And if you believe in catharsis, you might tell him to go to his local sort of sports store and buy a punching bag. And when he gets in an argument with his girlfriend, don't follow her around, don't get in her face. Just go down to the basement and just hit that bag. And I think if you recommend this intervention to this guy as a sort of practitioner, you should be a bit concerned about it, because what you're actually telling him to do is, when he feels anger, practice hitting something. And it turns out the more we repeat and practice something, the more likely that's the behavior that's going to emerge. So in our treatment, we try to figure out what some of the triggers are for people and to get them to practice new responses that'll be more productive for them. And so catharsis, for that reason, is an intervention that doesn't make a lot of sense for most people.
Tiffany, the historical context of this, there have been whole schools, haven't there, which have argued that expressing anger can be therapeutic.
Yes, we tend to think of this as a very 20th century thing. So I think sort of, in our modern sense, it comes really from Freud, and this notion that a repressed anger can kind of lead to actually physical symptoms like stomach aches or, headaches and so on. But actually, this isn't really just a 20th century phenomenon. There is some really interesting research done by one of my colleagues at the Centre for the History of the Emotions. She's called Elena Carrera, and she's been looking at the early modern context for the healthful expression of anger. And at that time, obviously they weren't thinking about the body and its emotions in quite the way that we do today. I mean, their idea of the body was based on the four humours: black bile, yellow bile, blood and phlegm, and these humours kind of sort of washed around the body, and they did all kinds of things, and they believed that anger would sort of raise the temperature of the body, and that would affect these humours in a certain way and sort of enliven the body. And so there are tales of physicians sitting by the bedside of very weak and debilitated patients and kind of reminding them of slights from the past in the hope that this would sort of reinvigorate them, sort of heat up their bodies and sort of allow the blood to flow, and this would actually perhaps allow them to get out of bed. And in fact, there's this wonderful example of the 13th century British alchemist and court physician Roger Bacon, and he wrote this whole treatise on how to cure old age, and his theory was that really getting angry every day was was the solution to keeping yourself young, because anger would heat up the body, and as you age, he believed the body cooled down. So anger was really the sort of secret to eternal youth.
Thank you very much, all three of you. Tiffany Watt-Smith, R. Douglas Fields, and Raymond Chip Tafreti. Next week, we'll be talking about oxygen, the stuff of life, its role in the human body, the history of oxygen here on Earth, and new discoveries in space in the tail of a comet. I'll be joined by a leading authority on geochemistry, an expert in respiratory medicine, and the lead scientist on the Rosetta Space Orbiter project. Till then, from me, Bridget Kendall, and all of us here at the Forum, do have a good week. And to give you a break from the human voice, here's a calming dawn chorus of gibbons and birds from the rainforests of Thailand.
If you've enjoyed this BBC podcast, why not try others, such as In Our Time, where Melvin Bragg discusses the history of ideas. To find out more, visit bbc.com/podcast.